April 14th, 1944. Espiritu Santo Naval Base, New Hebrides. The island air smelled of salt and diesel. Palm fronds swayed in a lazy breeze, a quiet contrast to the urgency buzzing through the docks like static. Navy Seabees swarmed like ants across a surreal stretch of steel rising from the turquoise shallows. Massive gray walls bolted together, floating, modular, and alive with purpose. This was not a battleship, not a cruiser, not an aircraft carrier. It was something stranger, something newer, a miracle born of iron and ingenuity. Bosun's mate, second class. Calvin Rourke wiped the sweat from his brow and stared in disbelief. 20 hours ago, the battleship USS South Dakota had limped into the atoll with a 6-degree port list, her side gashed open by a near-miss bomb and secondary explosion. She should have been done for. The Navy had no business fixing a ship like that this far from Pearl. And yet, here she sat, already rising slowly, inch by inch, from the sea. Not on a permanent dry dock, not in a mainland yard, but inside a folding, floating machine of war. A dry dock made of sections, steel boxes. The massive floating sectional dry dock, AFDB-1, known as Artisan, was an answer to a question no one had dared ask before the war. How do you fix the broken bones of a fleet when the battlefield is an ocean? Chief Engineer Wilbur H. Jones stood inside a reinforced operations hut at the edge of the dock, reviewing pressure gauges and ballast readings. He wasn't Navy. He wasn't even supposed to be out here. A civilian mechanical engineer from Pittsburgh, Jones looked more like a math professor than a miracle worker. And yet, it was his design, born from pre-war paper and slide rule equations, that made this scene possible. "Pump 3 down another 4 feet, he called to the control room operator. "We need uniform lift or she'll twist." The dry dock's heavy-duty pumps responded, sucking seawater from the ballast tanks. The sections, each one over 90 feet long, moved in perfect coordination, linked together like iron vertebrae. As water drained, the dock's entire mass rose, taking the wounded South Dakota with it. Jones stepped out into the harsh sunlight. His eyes flicked over to a row of welders already cutting away scorched armor plating. Time was everything. In a normal world, South Dakota would have had to steam back to Bremerton or San Francisco. That could take 3 weeks or more, if she made it at all. In that time, Japan's fleet could regroup, advance, fill the vacuum. Instead, thanks to a modular platform barely a decade old in concept, the battleship would be patched, reinforced, and back in the line within days. Above the dock, sailors leaned over railings, watching the whole strange ballet. Some lit cigarettes, others stared in silence. Word was spreading fast. The dock worked. It actually worked. Some said it defied gravity. Others whispered about the man who'd designed it. They called him Folding Jones. But back in 1940, before the Pacific War exploded into existence, no one had wanted to listen to him. Jones knew. He remembered the rejection letters, the skepticism, the naval bureaucrats who called his proposal impractical in a real-world scenario. A folding dry dock? Portable shipyards that could be assembled anywhere? Lunacy. But war doesn't care for polite disagreement. War moves fast. And now, so did repairs. As the dock lifted the South Dakota completely clear of the waterline, her wounds exposed to open air, Jones allowed himself one moment of silence. Then he turned to the next phase. The USS West Virginia, due to arrive tomorrow, needed a stern plate replaced. The floating dry dock was already prepped. Tools were stocked, crews briefed. War was not going to wait. But now, thanks to his strange modular beast, neither would the Navy. The vision that unfolded in the South Pacific had not emerged overnight. It began over a decade earlier, in an unassuming naval design office tucked within the Bureau of Yards and Docks in Washington, D.C. There, among blueprints of pier extensions and harbor renovations, a young civilian engineer named Wilbur H. Jones pored over sketches that didn't yet belong to any known category of naval infrastructure. It was 1932. Battleships still ruled the seas. Carriers were experimental. And the very idea of a floating dry dock, transportable across oceans, assembled in sections, and large enough to lift vessels displacing tens of thousands of tons, bordered on the absurd. Jones didn't think so. He had grown up around the rivers and steel mills of Pittsburgh, where he'd seen floating caissons and sectional barges reconfigured for flood control, bridge work, and salvage. To him, the leap from barge to floating dry dock was a matter of scale and engineering discipline, not fantasy. His initial concept, a dry dock composed of 10 or more identical sections, each with its own ballast system, electrical hookups, and modular reinforcements. Each section could be transported by towing vessels or heavy-lift ships, then reassembled like building blocks at forward operating bases. They'd be designed to handle anything from destroyers to capital ships. When he submitted his first draft to the Bureau, the response was tepid at best. Budget constraints, doctrinal conservatism, and the still lingering economic malaise of the Great Depression meant that the Navy was unwilling to gamble on an untested concept. Jones' idea was filed away, labeled as interesting but unlikely. Then came Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. Battleships lay broken and burning in the shallows of Oahu. The Pacific Fleet had been gutted, its infrastructure crippled. Suddenly, repairing ships became just as vital as building them. The Navy no longer had the luxury of dragging every damaged cruiser or carrier back across 5,000 miles of ocean to a West Coast shipyard. They needed solutions fast. And Wilbur H. Jones had one ready. The Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions formed after America entered the war, were already cutting runways into jungle islands and building bases on coral reefs. With their expertise in rapid, improvised construction, and with Jones's designs dusted off and greenlit by a desperate bureau, the floating dry dock project was approved. Code names were assigned, contracts awarded. Steel mills in the Midwest roared to life. Each section of the Advanced Base Sectional Dock, ABSD, weighed over 3,500 tons, measured 93 feet wide and 80 feet long, and could lift up to 10,000 tons. 12 or more in tandem could lift a full-sized battleship. The first of these giants, AFDB-1, soon nicknamed Artisan, was completed in record time. Towed across the Pacific in pieces and reassembled by Seabees at Espiritu Santo, it became the cornerstone of the Navy's forward repair capabilities. Other docks followed. At Guam, Ulithi, Manus, and other names unfamiliar to the American public but burned into the memories of every sailor who watched his ship rise from the sea on a platform of pure industrial genius. And now, in the spring of 1944, that vision was alive, a floating revolution anchored in war. As Jones made his rounds among the welders and pipe fitters on the dock, he rarely mentioned how many times he'd been told no. He didn't have to. The towering steel walls around him, bristling with cranes and hoses and reinforced scaffolding, said it for him. Every torch flame that cut through armor, every clang of rivet against bulkhead, every hydraulic hiss as ballast shifted. These weren't just the sounds of repair. They were the heartbeat of an idea that had finally proved itself indispensable. June 21st, 1944. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, a new industrial skyline jutted from the waters. Gray towers, cranes swinging, smoke rising from welding rigs. Ulithi had once been a quiet coral lagoon, known only to local islanders and passing Japanese scout planes. Now it was a floating city of war, and at its center stood a monster. AFDB-2, one of the Navy's newest floating dry docks, assembled in place from modular sections to create an engineering marvel that could lift an entire Essex-class aircraft carrier clear out of the sea. The USS Bunker Hill was bleeding oil. A kamikaze attack just days earlier during the campaign for the Marianas had ruptured her fuel lines and scorched her aft hangar deck. She limped into the lagoon trailing smoke and wounded men, her crew battered and reeling. On any other front, she'd be done for months. Instead, she was directed straight to the dry dock. Seabees and naval repair crews sprang into action before her screws even stopped turning. Tugboats positioned her precisely between the dock's parallel walls. Divers dropped beneath the keel, checking alignment and securing temporary cables. Control officers in the dock's command tower began the slow, precise dance of pumping out ballast. The entire process was a coordinated feat of engineering. 18 sections across the length of the dock, pumping thousands of gallons per minute from ballast tanks, each balanced to within inches. A slight miscalculation, and the ship could twist, buckle, or slip. But the design held. Jones' equations held. By morning, the Bunker Hill's waterline was high above the dock's platform. Teams immediately fanned out, patching scorched steel, replacing wiring, inspecting engines. Hull damage that would have required weeks to assess in a mainland yard was diagnosed within hours. Meanwhile, her crew offloaded ammunition, resupplied, and rotated wounded. The entire ship had been reborn into a floating construction yard. It wasn't just her. Across the Pacific, the floating dry docks were being tested like never before. At Manus, the USS Houston arrived with severe torpedo damage amidships. The artisan at Espiritu Santo pulled the USS West Virginia from the sea to install new hull plating and structural reinforcements. In each case, the dock sections, delivered in convoys, bolted together with inch-thick plates, equipped with power stations, cranes, and workshops, enabled repairs previously considered impossible without returning to the continental United States. And time was everything. Japanese military planners had bet on attrition. They assumed American carriers and battleships, once damaged, would take months to replace or repair. They had calculated their offensives around that delay, counting on the Pacific Ocean to serve as a natural barrier. But now, thanks to Wilbur H. Jones's floating vision, that barrier had collapsed. Ship after ship returned to the fight within days or weeks, not months. The dry docks didn't just save hardware, they saved tempo. They kept Task Force 58 hammering Japanese island fortresses without pause. They allowed Admiral Nimitz to advance without worrying about pulling his heavy assets from the front line. Even Japanese intelligence began to take notice. Captured documents from early 1945 included references to mobile dock structures and American ocean repair bases. Pilots were instructed to prioritize strange-looking installations at atolls. But hitting a dry dock wasn't so easy. They were built with defensive bulkheads, anti-aircraft mounts, and could often be submerged partially in shallow water to avoid detection. In emergencies, sections could be detached and towed elsewhere. It was a kind of flexibility the Imperial Japanese Navy could scarcely believe. On the steel decks of Ulithi, repair crews wrapped up their 20-hour shifts under makeshift sunshades, drinking from dented canteens, wiping soot from their faces. To them, this wasn't a revolution. It was just the job. Get the ship fixed, get it moving. But in the broader theater of war, Each weld and plate and rivet hammered into place by those anonymous hands was part of something far bigger. A technological shift that changed the rhythm of naval warfare forever. November 28, 1944. Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides. Rain hammered the corrugated rooftops of the dock offices as midnight approached. The harbor's surface shimmered with oil and moonlight, broken only by the shadow of a behemoth slowly rising from the Pacific. USS West Virginia, BB-48, the last of the Pearl Harbor ghosts, to rejoin the fleet. Inside the operations room of AFDB-1, now a veteran of over 24 major lifts, Jones sat hunched over schematics, watching the progress of the final stage of repairs. The West Virginia had arrived weeks earlier, bristling with upgrades but carrying damage from a near miss off Leyte Gulf. Torpedoes hadn't found her, but a Japanese glide bomb had exploded close enough to deform part of her lower hull and damage internal fuel piping. She needed inspection, precision work, reinforcement before steaming west. Now she hung above the water, her dull gray flanks lined with scaffolding, her crew spread out like ants along every gangway. Arc lights stabbed through the darkness, cutting shadows into the rising steam. Welding torches sizzled, hammer strikes echoed. The Drydock, stained from countless other lifts, embraced her like a cradle. The transformation of the West Virginia was more than technical. It was symbolic. She had gone down hard on December 7, 1941. Her hull torn open by 7 torpedoes, her decks ravaged by fire. For years her name had been a whisper, a memory of failure. But she had not died. She had been raised, rebuilt, and reborn. And now, thanks to the ingenuity of a dockyard dreamer from Pittsburgh, she was nearly ready to take her place in the line of battle again. Jones stepped out into the rain. A petty officer offered him a poncho, but he waved it off. He preferred to feel the storm on his skin. It reminded him he was alive, that his work mattered. Down on the dock floor, teams secured final components, access ladders, hydraulic lifts, inspection points. Chief Petty Officer Ramirez, one of the most experienced foremen on the Drydock, oversaw final clearance procedures. "Starboard aft's been pressure tested. Holding tight," he reported into the intercom. "Ballast checks are green. We're good for refloat on your orders, sir." Jones nodded silently. No ceremony, no speeches, just the quiet satisfaction of mission accomplished. By dawn, the West Virginia floated free once more. Her hull, patched, painted, and sealed, cut clean lines through the harbor as tugboats nudged her gently back into open water. Her propellers churned to life, her signal flags unfurled. She would sail for Iwo Jima, then Okinawa, then Tokyo Bay. The battleship that had once sunk to the bottom of Pearl Harbor would now witness the end of the empire that had struck her down. And behind her departure, as with so many others, stood the steel skeletons of the floating dry docks, silent, tireless, immovable in their purpose. No press release marked this success. No headline back home announced that a floating box of steel had helped win the war. But those who served aboard her knew. And the men who cut and welded and bolted those boxes into shape knew too. As Jones watched the West Virginia disappear beyond the reef line, he knew another would come, another wound, another repair. That was the rhythm now, not months, not weeks, just days. He turned back toward the dry dock. Rain still fell, work still called. August 15th, 1945. Ulithi Atoll. The war was over. Word spread across the fleet like a thunderclap. Radios buzzed, flags rose. On the flight decks and in the machine shops, men laughed, cried, cheered, or simply stared in silence. victory over Japan, the end of the long Pacific campaign. For some, it meant going home. For others, it meant remembering who never would. Inside Drydock AFDB-2, the last of the summer work orders were being cleared. Welding rigs sat idle. Cranes rested still above the dark water. The dock, like the men who served aboard it, bore the scars of war, pitted walkways, rusted seams, soot-stained cranes. Yet it still floated, still functioned. A monument not of marble, but of action. Wilbur H. Jones walked alone across the upper catwalk, a clipboard tucked beneath one arm. He was older now, his hair thinner, eyes ringed with exhaustion. But the pride hadn't faded. He paused at the far end of the dock, gazing out over the harbor where carriers, destroyers, and cruisers sat at anchor like steel titans at rest. Many of them had passed through the embrace of his invention, some more than once, some nearly lost, now whole again. Jones didn't speak. He didn't have to. The legacy was visible everywhere around him, in the ships repaired, the battles fought, the lives preserved by speed and structure. His floating dry docks hadn't just filled a logistical gap. They'd changed the very tempo of war. They had allowed the Pacific Fleet to maintain unrelenting pressure without the slow bleed of retreat. They had turned remote atolls into frontline yards. He walked past the nameplate bolted to the side of Section F, one of the original units. The serial number was worn, barely visible beneath chipped paint. This section alone had lifted 27 vessels since its deployment. It had crossed half an ocean in tow. It had survived a typhoon. Behind him, a mechanic from the Seabees saluted. "Sir," the young man said, "I just wanted to say thank you. I worked these docks at Manus and Ulithi. Got a cousin who came back because of them." Jones returned the salute, nodded once, and walked on. The dry docks wouldn't vanish with the peace. They'd be towed to Japan to help rebuild. Some would go to Korea, later Vietnam. A few would return to the mainland, rusting in silent harbors, forgotten by all but those who had seen what they could do. But the idea, Jones's idea, had proven itself eternal in the Kyoa. And it wasn't the size of the ship or the power of the engine that defined the Navy's dominance. It was the ability to stay in the fight, to come back from fire and steel, to never be gone for long. And that came down, in part, to one engineer, a set of bolts and ballast tanks, and the simple genius of building something that could rise from the sea and lift the fallen.